Welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of The Reading Cure. In this episode, we'll be discussing the book Solitude by Anthony Storr. Welcome to The Reading Cure, your monthly dose of bibliotherapy. My name is Dr. Stephen Davis, and my co-host is Dr. Alexander Fox. Now, the focus of this week's episode is the prolific writer, psychotherapist, and public intellectual Anthony Storr, who was born in London in 1920. Renowned for both his wisdom and compassion, Storr published over a dozen books between 1960 and his death in 2001, having previously established a successful and multifaceted career as both a consultant psychiatrist in various hospitals, as well as a practicing psychoanalyst, having trained under Jung's friend and colleague E.A. Bennett in 1951. Anthony was a late addition to the Storr family, with his mother Catherine, aged 44, and his father Vernon, a 51-year-old subdean of Westminster Abbey at the time of Anthony's birth. His childhood was blighted by physical illness, loneliness, and depression, the latter two in good part due to being sent to a strict boarding school from the age of 8, at which he was both bullied and socially isolated for periods of time. Storr found solace from the misery of his school life in music, playing the viola, piano, and singing in the choir, and harbouring early ambitions for a career as a professional musician. However, lacking the necessary aptitude for this, Storr would later gravitate towards psychiatry under the influence of his Cambridge tutor and eventual lifelong friend C.P. Snow. Storr was highly unusual in bridging the gulf between the often divergent specialisms of psychiatry and psychoanalysis, and attested that his professional and later literary endeavours were always fueled by a desire to solve some of the deepest puzzles of human nature. His perspective was always original. He resisted being pigeonholed into specific schools of thought within psychotherapy, and was once quoted as saying, "I want to show that the dividing lines between sanity and mental illness have been drawn in the wrong place. The sane are madder than we think, and the mad are saner." Anthony Storr's personal experiences of suffering and solitude, as well as his creative talents and in-depth knowledge of literature and classical music, all gave him ample material for his diverse range of literary output. His books are renowned for being deep yet accessible, and often explore both the darker sides of the human psyche, as well as possibilities for finding meaning and transcendence in creativity. Some of his best-known works include The Dynamics of Creation, The Art of Psychotherapy, Music and the Mind, and the focus of this episode, Solitude, subtitled A Return to the Self, published in 1988. In this latter work, Storr makes a compelling case for the at times underappreciated potential of solitude in allowing people to find meaning, mental well-being, and creative fulfillment in life. He recounts numerous fascinating case studies, ranging from Kafka to Beethoven, and Dostoevsky to Beatrix Potter, and in all cases highlights ways in which solitude was integral to their personal equilibrium and/or creative success. Now, before we begin our discussion of this superb gem of a book, I just want to remind you that we're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook if you'd like to follow us on social media. And we also have a Patreon page if you'd be interested in supporting the podcast there. Links to all of these are on our website, thereadingcure.com. And you can also email us if you'd like to give us any feedback on the show. You can reach us at thereadingcurepodcast@gmail.com. And would be interested to hear your thoughts if you want to get in touch with us there. But now, here is our conversation on Solitude by Anthony Storr. Okay, Okay, so first question tonight then, Alec. So Storr's primary argument in this book is that the field of psychotherapy often overemphasises the value of relationships to the detriment of interests that are pursued alone, and that at times this can almost lead to a pathologizing of people who are single and or people who like to spend significant amounts of time alone. So do you think he's right about this? And what do you see as the main benefits of solitude?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that when Storr was writing that book, psychoanalysis was the dominant paradigm in therapy, and he does refer quite a lot to object relations psychoanalysis as being the main perpetrator of this belief that relationships were the sole path to happiness. I'm not so sure that modern therapy, or at least counseling, is as dominated by that sort of theoretical model. So, person centered therapists, I don't think they would emphasize relationships to that extent, mainly because they believe in individuality. So, if the client was, say, particularly introverted, I don't think that they would feel that they had to be more gregarious necessarily, or that meaning and happiness would have to be found solely through relationships. So I'm not saying that Storr didn't have a point there about therapy, but maybe because there's a wider range of therapies now, it's less characteristic of therapy as a whole. I mean,
Yeah.
say pluralistic therapy, there's this notion of cultural resources as being a key part of, emotional health, emotional well-being. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're shared activities. It could be things like going hill walking alone or whatever. That could be seen as a cultural resource, a way of keeping oneself happy and fending off things like anxiety and depression. And I don't think a pluralistic therapist would say that these were inferior pursuits because they were done in solitude.
No, sure, that makes sense.
But
Yeah.
yeah, the second part about the main benefits of solitude, I think that, for me, what seems to be the main benefit is finding and sustaining your authentic self.
Yes.
So I mean, it's clear that the more agreeable you are as a person, the more that you will tend to go with the flow when you're in a group, or even when you're hanging out just with one person. That you're watching carefully how they're reacting, and this is shaping then your responses and what you think you would like to do.
Yeah.
And that solitude is a chance to step back from that and reconnect with your authentic self more, and also to work out how you've been behaving when you're around other people is how you want to be, something that you can forget in the moment when you're socializing. So I think that solitude is an opportunity to reconnect with that authentic self. Not to say that socializing is total inauthenticity. It's not like a dichotomy, but I think that it gives us that opportunity, and it also gives a real opportunity for self-reflection too, which is harder to do in company.
I quite agree. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with what you said there. Really, I think, I mean, it's a good point in terms of the therapy world has moved on. I think in terms of his, the argument that Storr was really feeling he needed to make at that time. I think you're right. Probably a lot of modern therapies wouldn't particularly object to the fact that, yeah, there's particularly for more introverted people, absolutely pursuits that have a kind of solitude element to them could be healthy. I guess just I suppose I could just summarize a few of the benefits that Storr kind of puts forward in this book, of solitude. I mean, he highlights things like rest cures. I mean, you obviously alluded there to, yeah, maybe people's, stepping back from company a little bit and kind of recharging. He highlights more sublime or even religious experiences, and obviously he's kind of critiquing Freud's view. He's maybe more on the William James camp there about the idea of, I think Freud was skeptical about more, these sublime experiences, he maybe saw it as more of a kind of infantile regression.
Yes.
Whereas obviously for somebody like James and others, these are things, these sublime
Mm,
experiences, and
mm,
perhaps in solitude, actually have a legitimate part to a really meaningful life, and that it's not really anything about
yes.
regression. So there's that, and there was an interesting example. He talks about bereavement at one point,
Mm,
and he contrasts the more British, stereotypically British stoical attitude. The idea, I think he
mm,
mentioned, the idea that somebody has had a bereavement and then is back at work the next day and they're not showing any
mm,
emotion about it, and that this could be seen as real strength, versus
mm,
he talks about rural Greece, people,
mm,
widows there having, a really, really protracted period of mourning and
mm,
withdrawal.
mm.
And again, it's two extremes, but I think, there probably is something to the idea that things like bereavement, really severe emotional
Yeah.
issues that, working through this to some extent in solitude, there could be part of the
Yeah, absolutely.
part of it for
Yeah, I
people.
mean, well, grief is a paradigm case of a rupture in the everyday fabric of your life.
Yes.
And so when something like that happens, it could be grief or it could be a breakup or some kind of thing that's happened in adversity that's impacted that everyday life that you've been leading, that solitude can be useful in the as a means to reflect on that, to process, as we say nowadays, these emotions, whether it's grief or anything else, and hopefully help us to re-enter that world again and feel that we've recuperated and we've learnt from it.
Well, exactly. I mean, obviously as a therapist, you'll maybe have a view on this one, but I thought it was interesting. Storr made the claim that what he called sense making or pattern forming, in other
Yeah,
words, the thinking through the consequences, he says, are equally relevant to recovering from neurotic illness as a therapeutic relationship.
yeah.
And I thought that's an interesting point. Actually, that sense making, which doesn't need solitude, obviously, but that would seem to be surely a part of it. Doesn't need exclusively
Uh,
solitude. It probably, would benefit from some solo reflecting, I would have thought.
yeah, well, I mean, as you know, there's a chapter on the need for coherence, which is what you were referring to with pattern making or
Yeah.
sense making. And I think it's generally true that when there is the introduction of a certain incoherence into your life, that is what prompts reflection,
Yep.
and that it is not easy to do that around other people unless it's somebody like a therapist, say, or a very attentive and willing friend.
Yes.
But in general, it's something that people have to do more on their own, as much as they can anyway. Obviously, people have different abilities and skill levels in doing that.
Yeah.
But obviously, the most clear example of an incoherence in one's life is when you've suffered a trauma,
Yep.
which is like what Raymond Berger calls the unthinkable has happened. And you've got to then find a way of recalibrating your world for that trauma to make sense. Now, people will do that in therapy, and they probably have to also do some reflecting in solitude too.
Yes.
So, I mean, yeah, if you're someone that is particularly intellectually or artistically inclined, and another way of putting that is that you're someone that is sensitive to incoherences,
Yeah.
and that you suffer more of these ruptures, if that's the right way of putting it, than other people. And therefore, you're prompted to go off and reflect on those things and find a new form of integration of the self.
I completely agree. I mean, there was a good quote actually I wrote down on that point actually from Storr. He says human beings easily become alienated from their own deepest needs and feelings. Learning, thinking, innovation, and maintaining contact with one's own inner world are all facilitated by solitude. And I think, whether it be, as you suggested, recovering from a trauma or whatever it may be, just kind of
Yeah.
reintegrating the self. Yeah, I mean, again, obviously, if you're in company, on a kind of practical level, you are having to think about accommodating other people. Are you getting on with them and so on? So yeah, there's obviously a space where you don't have to do that. Surely, if you're going to really be thinking deeply and processing what's going on,
Yeah.
it's kind of hard really to see how you could do that without solitude, at least some of the
Well,
time.
yes.
I mean,
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe we can make a good case for solitude by looking at its opposite. I mean, I don't know if our listeners are acquainted with Sartre's play No Exit, but basically it's about them in this hotel room, if I can recall correctly, which is like a kind of purgatory where they can't leave and they have no solitude. And basically they're subjected to each other's understandings of the other,
okay,
and they're
yep,
trying to mold each other to their perception of the person, which is what Sartre thought was hellish. It has that famous quote, "Hell is other people."
yeah.
Now, what I think we're talking about is not socializing per se, but how hellish it might be to not be able to move away and reconnect with oneself. If you were actually stuck in a room with four other people, say for eternity, and you were stuck with their perceptions of you, and that's a kind of bondage in a way. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that people are in that stark situation in general, but I'm sure people have felt constrained heavily at times when they've been around people too much and they felt they've lost touch with themselves. So, yeah, I think the need for solitude is kind of highlighted by Sartre's play because it's the opposite scenario or existential situation.
It's a great example. I think you're right. I mean, for me as a more introverted person, immediately, this point you're making about this, in really protracted company, that maybe sense of starting to lose your sense of self a little bit, and that hellish kind of vision that Sartre's depicted there certainly does resonate. And I would imagine that everybody, to some extent, even the more extroverted, would still need that little bit of time to recharge and reset themselves, just in order to keep that feeling really of integration. I
Yes,
would,
yeah,
yeah. I mean,
yeah. I mean, I think so. Although we have to be aware of the diversity of how people can be, but yes, I think that it would be rare for a extrovert not to need any solitude, because I mean, as Storr makes clear in his eloquent and humane book, we're part of our being is not defined solely by socializing. And that would apply to even extroverts, even if it's maybe not as central to them. I
yes.
think, of course, that, while the Sartre situation highlights how awful it is to not have any solitude, I
Hmm.
think Storr also highlights that, that there's such a thing as enforced solitude, that there's a thing called, reclusiveness. And we'll have to bear in mind that in certain company we do find ourselves too. So, I mean, certain company can be a route to authenticity too. I
Oh,
mean, that's what we usually mean by friends.
yes.
But I think that the more that we reflect on that, the more we're aware that even with our friends, there may be times where we feel that, oh, but I'm not actually believing this anymore, or maybe they're misrecognizing me, or maybe I've, um, you know, haven't made myself clear. And so you have to go away and reflect on that in solitude. And I think that, good friendships are sustained and they grow through solitude in part.
Definitely. I mean, and I think that's an interesting point, you make about the fact that Story, he gets into, enforced solitude, good and bad solitude and so on. And I think we'll probably come to that in the next question. I was just thinking as well, I wonder, obviously, as we've discussed, there isn't really a particularly an argument at least in terms of the field of psychotherapy. So it would seem, in terms about, the value of solitude to some people. I wondered from a kind of wider cultural point. I was reminded reading this book a little bit of the book by Susan Cain called Quiet, The Power of Introverts, which that's really only about 10 years old, Cain's book, and she talks about a Western cultural bias towards extroversion. And there was a nice quote from it. She says, introversion, along with its cousins, sensitivity, seriousness, and shyness, is now a second-class personality trait, somewhere between a disappointment and a pathology. And she's really arguing that, maybe there's a kind of implicit devaluing culturally of people who like to spend time alone. Do you recognize that, or do you think?
Yeah, I think so, and I think this was I was actually going to mention this regarding Storr's book, that if we look at how his account applies to modern therapy, we might end up being overly critical of what he says, because I think his point applies more widely.
Yeah.
As you say with the Susan Cain book. I mean, you know that one of the main characterizations of people that were introverts was loners. This sort of American term, I think, originally.
Yep.
And America's quite an extrovert culture, as she talks about. And so this idea of loner, that solitude is being pathologized, really, and that people should want to be socializing a lot, want to spotlight themselves, and not really want to be on their own much at all.
Yes.
And I think that that is the fundamental point of Storr's book, which is that it's not just that there are introverts that want to have their solitude, and that's important. He was also arguing, I think, a wider point, which is that to be fully human, there should be solitude as part of one's life, part of one's regime, as it were. I think he was applying it even to extroverts to some extent, because, as he was saying, we're not defined solely by our social relations. We also have, as he says, impersonal interests, which is what Viktor Frankl might put as self-transcending interests, like interest in art, music, philosophy, these are more impersonal interests.
Definitely. I mean, without doubt, I think, you've summarised it very well there, Alec. And it's interesting that, as you said, I mean, he's talking about something that is relevant to all human beings here, actually. And it is interesting, that obviously Cain gets into the fact that some countries, say like Japan, for example, are more introverted by culture.
Yes.
And, there's the way she depicts it, as I kind of read it, there is a kind of sense that cultures tend to go one way or the other, maybe disproportionately emphasising more the introverted or more the extroverted side. But as you said, I mean, really, it comes back to that point that there's certain kinds of activities associated with growth and meaning making and so on that you can't really get solitude completely out the picture. However sociable you might be, and as you said, even great friendships, a lot can be done in terms of developing ideas, of course, and so on. But it would seem to be part of a healthy life in some sense, that just really inescapably.
Yes, and I can remember this line from a Peter Handke novel where the husband says to the wife, "For us to be fully together, we must be apart at times."
Yeah, that's good.
And that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yes.
In the extroverts, like anyone else, want to bring substantial things to say to the table.
Yep.
And to do that, you've got to at times have solitude. I'm not saying it's the only way to reflect or ponder. Obviously, Socrates thought that a good blether was a way of finding out things, right?
That's not quite the words he used, but I think
but we're Scottish, and we'll put it as a good blether.
A good blether,
I mean, blether obviously makes it sound rather innocuous. The poor thing was put to death because of what he was corrupting these people's minds as they saw it.
Yes,
so a blether doesn't typically do that. But I'm just meaning, that he thought a good chat about key ideas was a way of uncovering the truth, and that there is a truth to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that it's also good to emphasize that we're never actually alone, even internally, because, as we're thinking something through, our thought process could be shaped by, well, what will so-and-so think about that?
That is true.
And
Yep.
so even when we're in solitude, we're still influenced and at times haunted by other people. I don't want to say we're haunted to the extent that Norman Bates is with his mother, right?
Not
That
ordinarily, no.
not ordinarily, but I think part of the interest of that movie is that Norman Bates's predicament is an exaggerated and very pathological form of our own inner critic.
Yeah,
And
that's you're right. I mean and that ties in actually with the second question we're going to come to, which maybe I can just kind of fit in, and we can carry on with that. Excellent
I
point. And
just
yeah,
What I would just say to finalize what we're saying here about the first question is that I did feel reading the Storr book that intriguingly I thought, right, he's giving me permission to actually value my solitude more. And that was one of the nicest things about it. I didn't think I would feel that when reading the book because I thought I already, understood and accepted and valued that solitude. But clearly, I had been shaped by some of those norms too, and so there was quite a therapeutic element to reading that book for me.
I agree. You're right. It's nice to get such an eloquent defense of something that feels right, but you're kind of aware that sometimes there's almost implicit need to justify that. Too much quiet time might seem dull, or that there's just these kind of lingering at times sense of cultural judgment for more solitary pursuits as maybe being inferior in some ways to more sociable pursuits. Yeah, I didn't want to. Definitely don't want to shut down the interesting point that you were making about about Norman Bates and inner critics. So
Mm,
just to
mm,
come to that second question,
yeah.
obviously, Storr recounts in this book the lives of many creative types, writers, composers, and so
Mm,
on, who
mm,
have. For them, solitude has been a vital part of their creative process. But in some cases, some have had a lot of emotional, psychological, mental health type issues.
mm, mm,
There's been a
mm.
real variety there. So I just wondered, we taking that solitude is important for creative types. What would you see as the difference between, say, high quality solitude and that maybe which is detrimental? Obviously, Norman Bates being really the the extreme case of detrimental solitude.
I mean, I think I don't want to push the Norman Bates issue too much. I was just speaking in terms of that was a real, extreme example of how we're never fully alone,
Yes,
and
indeed.
our inner critic is a bit like our inner parent. With Norman Bates, it's taken to an extreme extent.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of that question between healthy and unhealthy solitude, maybe a profitable way of looking at it is to bring Karen Horney back,
Well,
that we
yeah.
covered earlier on
Uh,
in a podcast. That
yep.
because as you know, she talks about the moving away person,
Yes.
and that is someone that is reclusive. It's like a compulsive solitude, and an unhealthy one.
Yeah.
And what she talks about with the moving away kind of person, the reclusive person, that it's a negative freedom. So she says, and I think this is a very key and profound point, that it's about the freedom from, but not the freedom to. And so what I understand by what she meant by that is that the person wants to be free of what they see as burdensome entanglements
Yes.
with others. But then when they're on their own, they don't do much, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Because they don't really have the freedom to do much. They wanted just simply the freedom from. So, this could be the kind of person that doesn't socialize, but then doesn't do much with that solitude. So I think one of the key differences between healthy solitude and unhealthy solitude is that, do you feel liberated? Do you feel like you've then got time to do some meaningful things? Or is it the case that you're simply feeling liberated from people, and then you're somewhat wallowing and ruminating and not doing much constructive on your own.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's an interesting one to the Karen Horney link there. I think you're right. Obviously, in the Storr book, he brings in the point that Winnicott had made, which I thought was really
Yes.
interesting, about the attachment issue. About maybe the what you're describing, a kind of a moving away type has maybe had some kind of attachment potentially. I mean, obviously, we don't know why people. Can't say for sure why they'd be that type, but there could be that sense that somebody with an insecure attachment therefore has, or an ambivalent attachment, actually I think would be more the label there, it would be people would be difficult, whereas Winnicott suggests actually those with securest attachment, as infants, can then actually enjoy solitude without the sense of the fear. It's not, as you said, they need to get away from something. They can almost feel like there's a good presence with them in the form of the kind of the securely attached parent figure, that they can then almost be in solitude in parental company in that way. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And of course that ties in with what we were just saying about never being fully alone, because Winnicott was highlighting that an adult that has the capacity to be alone is taken in or introjected, as they say in psychoanalysis, the good mother.
Yes.
The mother that is able to be with them as they're retreating within themselves, which then means that the adult can look within but still feel connected to the world at large. The world at large, all is well, or well enough, and they can look within and get in touch with their authentic impulses, which is different to ruminating. Because unhealthy solitude tends to be in excess of the cognitive, whereas what Winnicott was talking about was actually getting in touch with your authentic impulses. Well, I really want to listen to some music, or I really want to watch this, but that kind of thing, that sense of aliveness.
I mean, it's almost. I think you're absolutely spot on. Sometimes it could almost be a kind of subtler difference as well, because you're right. I mean, rumination obviously is the classic unhealthy, negative emotional state kind of activity that you could do on your own. On the other hand, though, if you were sitting, say, reflecting on yourself or getting in touch with feelings, that would be deeply productive. There's that subtle difference there in a sense, but it's like, as you said, it really does relate back to prior social experiences and maybe how we feel about other people, whether those voices that are coming through when we're alone are the inner critic and self-hate and so on, or whether that we're not really experiencing that, and therefore we're a bit lighter, and freer actually in our solitude to do these more creative, enjoyable things, I guess.
Exactly. I think that when we're in that unhealthy solitude, we're feeling as an outsider. And I think that if we look at the need for coherence, that rumination is an attempt, often an unsuccessful attempt, to re-establish a coherence. But I think the difficulty is that when people retreat from the world and see themselves in a very negative light, it's very hard to then re-establish a coherence where you believe that there's no place for you in the wider society. And so that becomes a real issue. Whereas I think that the self-reflecting that leads to, as Storr speaks about, a reintegration of the self, and that would also mean a reintegration of oneself and the wider world to some extent.
Exactly, yeah.
Not to say that there isn't any tensions there between oneself and the world, or within oneself, but it's trying to find some accommodation, at the very least, between oneself and the world, whereas the recluse or the moving away person is someone that doesn't really believe that they could re-enter the world productively, and it's had to then retreat from it, and will then tend to be lost in spirals of self-hate and self-criticism.
Yeah, I think you've really captured it there, Alec. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think you mentioned previously as well the idea of self transcendence. And it's
Mm,
like really to have good solitude, it has to be, well, it has to have a number of elements, but one of them maybe being interspersed actually with good company that's
mm.
fulfilling in the right way, such that the person doesn't get into this, I suppose you could say, overly self fixated trap. In their
Mm.
rumination, they
Yeah,
actually, because in a way, in quality solitude, you are yourself, but you kind of want to lose yourself while you're there. I guess it's you're
yeah, yeah.
especially if it's, say, doing something creative. It's the opposite of rumination in that way. It's really is a self transcendent feeling. But yeah, too much solitude actually, maybe that would become hard to do. It would be that sort of downward
Yes.
spiral scenario. I would have thought.
Yeah, well, I think the thing is that rumination as a style of thought is endlessly repetitive,
Yeah.
but it is an attempt for people to establish a coherence. It's a desperate attempt to establish a coherence when they're either approaching it from the wrong angle or they don't have enough information to
Okay.
actually solve the issue, and so they endlessly chew. I mean, the word rumination comes from the idea chewing, the cow chewing the cud.
Yeah. Yep.
So it's this idea going over something repeatedly, endlessly, with no real result. And actually, it can end up being the very negation of thought. A bit like if you chew something enough, it just is obliterated, and so it doesn't really lead to insight.
Yes.
But it could be. But what it's predominantly focused on is a sense of control.
Okay. Yeah.
It's this idea that if I think about something long enough, I'll come up with an answer. And you could say that there's like too much faith placed in thinking alone,
Yes.
out with the world of action. Whereas the person that is having a healthy period of solitude is someone that is balancing reflection and action
Yeah.
in their lives.
I mean, what you're describing is slightly reminding me of our earlier conversation when we looked at Alan Watts's wisdom of
Mm,
insecurity. The idea of being in the flow of life, not
mm,
getting caught up in security fixations, actually, and
yeah.
trying to perfect or control the environment of the body in that way, but actually losing that in a kind of more self transcendent way. Yeah, that's
Yes,
interesting.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, solitude could be part of being in that flow of life, but an unhealthy version, when we're ruminating, is an attempt to control that flow,
Yeah.
to sort of stop the river or divert it in a way that you can't necessarily do.
Yes.
And that would be also, I think, like there's an isolation to rumination, which is not necessarily there when you're reflecting in a healthy way on your own. Because
Yeah.
yeah,
No, sorry. Go on. Go on.
yeah, I think with rumination there is an isolating element because it's almost like one has to sort it out all oneself in one's head. So it's a bit like you feel detached from humanity at large, and you alone have to do it. You have to solve it, and you've got to solve it in your head.
Well,
Where yeah,
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, whereas there's something. One of the things I guess that it's possible, I suppose, to forget really about when being in the flow of life is that there is just that felt sense of connectedness that in a way is lost when somebody's
mm,
really lost in their thoughts and ruminating, and therefore because they feel emotionally isolated or existentially isolated, there's almost that need to, like you said, come up with a solution, come up with control. That in a way, it's like a false dilemma that just disappears when a person feels more connected to
mm,
life,
mm.
connected to others, and so on. So yeah, it's like a subtle existential shift, or just a place that people could maybe get lost if they're moving away too much.
Yes, yeah.
Um,
Whereas, I mean, what Winnicott was talking about with the good enough mother, the mother that was sitting with the baby in that state of reverie, is that sense of still being connected to that outside world in a way, and still being anchored by a
Yeah,
sense of connection to the world. So
absolutely.
it's
Yeah.
quite different to the experiential feeling of rumination.
Yeah. Another interesting angle I thought when, thinking about the issue of high quality solitude versus detrimental solitude, he obviously, Storr gives some examples of, cases where people have been in imposed solitude, solitary confinement. And he obviously goes through, what are the destructive elements of that, which of course there are. But it was interesting, he comes to the case of various creative types like
Mm,
Dostoevsky with his
mm,
periods of imprisonment, and then the likes of Beethoven with his the isolation or that comes
yeah.
from his deafness, and in both
Mm,
cases I thought what was interesting was that he was talking about people who you could say were, say, creative with really strong inner resources,
mm,
they
mm,
actually may, when solitude of a sort was inflicted on them, it actually
mm,
caused less harm. It was like there was something about, he talked like Dostoevsky. I think for him, he'd been in solitary confinement, and I think he actually did a lot of writing. And
mm,
then he
mm,
had a period where he was imprisoned and he was given absolutely no solitude
mm.
at all, and that was actually much harder for him to deal with,
Yes,
because
yeah.
so it was interesting, reading about these people whereby even enforced solitude, not that that would be ideal for thriving, but in a way it could be weathered more because of their kind of more creative.
Yeah, yeah, and
Uh,
I think that's a good point, and I imagine it's just by accident that this has also been covered a bit in our Shawshank podcast because
yeah.
the main character at one point I think he's asked by Red, how he managed to survive that enforced solitude, and he says something like he took Mozart with him,
Yeah.
and in other words that he's still in touch with what's most meaningful to him in his life, even in enforced solitude. And
Yeah.
when we talked about that movie, we obviously spoke about that the character was rather special in that he was still able to thrive in that circumstance of enforced solitude.
Yeah.
When we're looking at, people like Dostoevsky that has got a great creative talent, then yes, it could be an opportunity to
Yeah.
and I think we also have to take into account the kind of material that Dostoevsky was writing. I mean, if he had been a creative writer of more light comic fiction, say, and then he'd been put in enforced solitude, maybe that wouldn't have been so useful for that,
Probably
like
not.
was it Alexander McCall Smith or something? I mean, maybe he
Yes.
could, maybe the guy could handle enforced solitude. Or even if we think about somebody like Barbara Pym, to stick to people we've covered so far, I'm
Yep.
not sure that enforced solitude would have helped for her writing her kind of material as good as it was.
Yeah. That's true.
With Dostoevsky, it was all about revelations of the spirit and about adversities, and I could see like that enforced solitude could almost be like, evoking it in some ways as well.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that thing of that famous quote from Wilde when he was in the jail, a kind of workhouse, and that he'd
Mm.
said he had never been so busy but never been so idle as
Yeah.
well. So I
Yeah.
mean that was a case of that there wasn't so much opportunity to undertake creative work for Wilde. But
Yeah.
then he did write De Profundis in there,
Yeah. Well. Yeah. That's true.
and which
Yeah.
had a more somber tone than it wasn't so much prone to irony as his other works.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean the thing is that I mean creativity is obviously about to some extent exploiting opportunities or at least transforming the given. And a creative person may be able to take unfavorable circumstances and still use it for their benefit.
Yes.
I think that Storr was obviously saying, or at least I read him as saying, that solitude is almost necessary for creative work. And proof of that is that even in adverse circumstances, people like Dostoevsky are still creative.
I
Um,
think so. Yeah, I mean, he goes through a wide range of personality types, which is interesting to read. But yeah, I mean, there was one quote I noted. He said, "Many creative people appear to nurture their talents more than they do their personal relationships." And I think he was, in a way, trying to say that while conventionally they might be, that might be seen as antisocial, there might be seen as, too much, a disproportionate, unbalanced emphasis on their solo creation. Maybe that was actually okay for those individuals. Actually, maybe that was, I mean, Kafka obviously is a tricky one because he obviously had such a kind of difficult, relationship with other people, and and precarious mental health. But I mean, it's hard to judge when you're talking about somebody that's produced great creative works. It would be pretty difficult to then start being too critical of their choices, actually, when it came to how much they did or didn't socialize. Because it does obviously, that something.
Well, I mean, I think that's true. I think that's true, and I think what Storr was saying is that we can't expect these people to be rounded or balanced in the ordinary way, because if they were, they probably would struggle to write what they wrote. And so there had to be some kind of creative imbalance in their lives for them to produce what they did, and that meant downplaying to some extent more the social aspect of life for them. But I think what he was saying is that this is a viable way to be. It's not without its problems, but then so is socializing and relationships.
Absolutely.
So I think he was saying that this is a viable way to be. I mean, if I could summarize overall what I think Storr did very well in this book, I think that what he was a brilliant defense lawyer for that way of life.
Yeah.
And he didn't do it in a contrived way, but subtly and in a sustained way, he argued the case for that. And I think that's what made it a very humane book. To me.
I think you're right about that. I mean, he does, because obviously we've discussed, earlier on, why the majority might benefit from solitude, and then he's obviously getting into these more special cases where, again and again, he's finding compelling arguments actually in favor of why the choice of solitude might not be a pathological one, why it might be the better choice for that individual. And I think he is. He's a very good advocate of that, and he's always doing it, of course, in a qualified way. He's highlighting when it can go too far, when it can destroy people, and also he's not actually arguing against relationships at any point in the book. He's very much saying that they could also, of course, that's part of a fulfilling and happy life, albeit again maybe with a caveat that for certain more creative types, maybe they are just a less important aspect of their life. That maybe is just how it is. Their art comes first.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are some writers that I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, George Simenon. I think that's not quite how you pronounce it, but that wrote the Migraine novels.
Oh yes, okay, yep.
But he also wrote literary fiction, and he was highly regarded in France. But I mean, he wrote a lot of books, and he had a woman every night practically.
Wow. Okay.
So the thing is that he was quite adventurous in that regard, while also being this highly regarded writer. Yep. And we'll look at Camus as well, that would have been introverted to some extent, but also was quite gregarious at times too.
Yep.
So I mean, again, and of course Sartre as well. I mean, there's that well-known story that when he flew over to Ireland to work on the screenplay of Moby Dick with John Huston, who was an introvert, that Huston found it very difficult because Sartre wouldn't shut up.
That's interesting.
So the thing is, and Sartre was the very definition of a writer, an intellectual. Yeah. But he liked to sit in cafes, and I'm not going to use the word blether again, by the way.
I'm quite okay.
Have a discussion. And,
and it's interesting, isn't it, that obviously, as you mentioned, there's no exit play earlier. Obviously, that he was evoking that experience in Houston.
Well, he was, and of course, you can see that these things aren't inconsistent, because if somebody was, I mean, a J.D. Salinger is probably not going to be so much worried about hell being other people, because he was rather. You could say reclusive, or he had his solitude. Where I don't know enough about his life, But
Yeah.
he's not going to worry about that because that's not a threat. Whereas Sartre would be around people so much and like talking, you could
Yes.
see why he could actually, that could be a version of hell because it's
Yeah.
something that you could slip into.
It's true.
Um,
Yeah, that's that. Yeah, you're
but
quite
but
right. Yeah.
the writers do vary in that regard, and artists as well.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, what Storr was doing was defending the legitimacy of that, and I think also in a wider sense he was making the point that we've got to be careful about what we pathologize, and that even if something was not healthy in one respect, it could still be healthy in another sense. This is complex.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a good summary of it there. Yeah, even though we can accept that too much solitude obviously can come with problems, and we've talked about moving away types and
Mm,
so on, where that can go a bit wrong with rumination. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think there is that need to be a little bit cautious before rushing to judgments about solitude. But obviously, as we've said, that the kind of cultural say tendency towards extroversion and maybe value in extrovert type activities is something we do need to just maybe be a little bit wary of, that we don't rush
yeah.
to these kind of judgments. I'm wondering, actually. I mean, our next question. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about the fact that even the idea is solitude a little bit like exercise, and that everyone, even the most
Mm,
extroverted,
mm.
should learn to value and cultivate it. And we've sort of seemed to have kind of agreed on that. The follow up there was, if so, why do you think some people find it hard to tolerate time alone? Um,
Yeah,
what's
yeah. Well, I
yeah,
mean, I think, I mean, part of that could go back to what Winnicott was saying about the capacity to be alone, that
yeah,
some people might not have had that attachment or that good enough mothering, as he put it, and therefore that, you know, when they're on their own, they feel isolated. That,
okay,
they haven't really interjected or taken in that stable, empathic presence that
yes,
those that have achieved that. So, I mean, that's how Winnicott might see it.
yep,
As to why that happens, I don't really know. I mean, it could be in part that they've maybe got a mother that is. This is something that Masood Khan talked more about, more intrusive into their world,
okay,
and therefore the the infant develops a false self as a way of accommodation.
okay, yeah,
So, what Winnicott and Masood Khan were writing about was this idea of impingements on the baby's being,
yes,
and that's what leads to a false self. And of course, if you develop that false self, you haven't really had that time to be yourself, which could mean that in later life, when you're on your own, you feel alone
yeah,
and you feel isolated. So, I mean, that's one way of looking at it. I mean, I think, a more prosaic thing, if I think about, say, my gran that grew up in a family environment where there were so many people around her, it was then hard for her to be on her own because she wasn't used to it.
yeah,
Really,
of course, yeah,
that some people might grow up in environments where they're around big families, and then they get married, and they have children themselves, and so that is the norm, and they're not used to being on their own, having solitude. They might be scared of it
yeah.
in some ways. So I mean, that's a prosaic sort of example, but
No,
uh,
I think these are all reasonable cases. I mean, there was one I noted down. I think a quote from Storr, who said that I think an extrovert may lose contact with their subjective needs by becoming overly involved with or losing themselves in their object. And I think there was another point he said: extreme extroversion leads to the individual losing his own identity in the press of people and events. And I think, I think you're describing obviously people who just maybe have never really experienced solitude, actually, because of their family circumstances and so on. I could imagine there might be, a sense that it suddenly might seem quite scary, actually, that they're so used to their identity just almost being blended with their social setting that the sudden removal of that, I guess, could be something that causes anxiety. And I think your point about attachment definitely could be another reason to explain that, the idea of feeling, that suddenly vulnerable, suddenly alone, suddenly at risk in terms of, being in solitude. So yeah, I suppose there would be various situations like that would make sense.
Yes, and I mean, and it might be that extroverts just innately find it more challenging,
Yeah.
just as introverts might find it innately more challenging being at a party.
Yep.
Which is not to say that it's bad for introverts occasionally to go to parties, or
Of course. Yeah.
likewise, it's not bad for extroverts to have some solitude at points. But yeah, I mean, the Jungian idea of extroversion is that the focus is on and the trust is in the external world.
Yes.
So Jung believed that extroverts put their faith in the world and not so much in themselves, where it's the other way around with introverts, which means that in some sense, the introvert is almost like a latent paranoid.
Okay.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
the, in the if your faith is put in your own perceptions, your own sense of what's going on, your own reading or interpretation of the world, you can see
Yeah.
how under stress that could descend into more paranoid
Yeah. Yeah.
views.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But yeah, you can see then that if your trust is in the world fundamentally as an extrovert, that then, and of course the social world, that then when you're on your own, you're kind of out with your comfort zone, really, and it
Yeah.
might be rather uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And of course, Storr isn't saying that people have to like solitude equally,
No.
just like how people don't necessarily like going to big group parties equally. But I think he was just arguing that it was like a psychological vitamin for
Yeah.
introverts and extroverts. But I think extroverts might find it more and be more unsettled by being on their own in solitude.
Yeah, that is interesting. The Jungian kind of take on these two was reminding me there in Susan Cain's book about introverts. She brings up the point, because she's really taken to task the idea that she thinks that Western, particularly corporate world and education and so on, overemphasizes the need for collaboration. She has this chapter I think called "When Collaboration Kills Creativity," and she mentions about the famous Ash experiments, which involved they had participants who were shown various pictures of different lengths of lines, and they were just asked to say which card showed the matched up with the one that we're seeing. A kind of simple visual experiment, but it highlighted that as soon as they were put in a group with some plants who were deliberately choosing the wrong answer, 75% of the participants apparently conformed and almost knowingly chose the wrong answer, but convinced themselves that it was maybe the right answer because they were so socially influenced. I thought that is an interesting point about about the you were talking about the object, the extrovert view that the object, the outer world is right versus the introverts potentially more paranoid faith in self, judgment. Obviously when it comes to, you can see why when it comes to, I suppose, creativity or innovation in the workplace, too much collaboration could kind of kill that off, actually, if we have that tendency towards conformity, actually, in terms of what others seem to be thinking. So yeah, it's an
Well,
interesting.
yes, yeah. I mean, the thing is that a group talking together about a certain thing could potentially lead to more objectivity.
Yep.
Because people, you might have different biases that sort of somewhat iron themselves out through that collaboration. But alternatively, it may lead to a consensus and maybe even a delusional one.
Yeah, that's
And
interesting.
that's a threat as well. So, yes, again, we mustn't assume that groupthink is going to be more objective. On the other hand, we
Yep.
needn't say that it's necessarily always going to be lacking in objectivity. It just depends on how people discuss things, and also the pressure to conform. I mean, in that situation you're describing, probably one of the reasons that people went with other people's perceptions is the fear of getting something wrong,
Yes.
which is a considerable fear that people have.
Yeah.
And if they get, say if the plants in that situation were particularly forthright and confident in
Yes.
their perception,
I think they were.
then
Yes.
if people were unsure, it's like, oh well, these people probably are right, and I don't want to seem stupid.
Yeah.
As I'm saying this, I'm keenly aware that I'm going to be doing jury duty next month, and I'll have
Yes.
to think about that group thing.
Think what you need to do is watch that film 12 Angry Men before that to get in the
Exactly,
right
yeah,
spirit.
that great movie.
Yes,
Or I
indeed.
might just want to get out early and just not care. But no, I'm not going to do it that way. I've watched 12 Angry Men a number of times, and I think I've absorbed the moral of that.
Yes, I would have thought so. Yes,
but if it goes on longer than a week,
but
so
yes,
yeah, I mean the thing is we can be taken out of ourselves, and sometimes that's a criticism and sometimes that's a liberation, because if you're in a funk and you meet up with a good friend, you can get taken out of your mood, out of yourself, and that's a good thing.
yeah,
Other times though, it could be that you know you're talking to someone that has no sensibility for what you're discussing, and then it can be quite an alienation from that part of oneself.
that's true. Yeah,
So
yeah,
if you're say philosophically minded and you're talking to someone that has no interest, and I don't mean no interest in terms of the subject directly. I just mean that style of thinking about life. If that's not part of who they are,
yeah.
then of course you shouldn't then be continuing to talk about that, because that's not going to be productive. But you can see how it could, if that's reinforced enough, lead to an alienation from that part of oneself.
Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it was another interesting angle actually that we've not quite mentioned yet that I thought Storr brought up, because we've talked about the introverts and extroverts and so on. He mentions various other sort of ways of typing people, and there was one he talked about by Gardner. I can't remember much really about Gardner, but
Gardner, yeah.
Howard Gardner's, yeah, and he talked about the fact that when it comes to creativity, he was kind of splitting people into patterners and dramatists, and
Yes, yeah.
Storr says he felt this kind of correlated about, the patterners being a bit more like introverted types who are looking for maybe less relational, more, maybe more something like abstract art or whatever, whereas dramatists maybe actually people oriented, but benefiting from solitude in order to create art about people, and make sense of relational issues in that way. I thought that, that is also an interesting way that a sensitive extrovert might process actually some of the difficulties, like you just suggested, maybe where somebody doesn't respond to the kind of things they like to talk about, or whatever else it might be. Art can be a refuge for them, a way to work through things.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I think that dramatizers versus patterners, is sort of like what I was saying with the Jungian idea of extroversion and introversion, because the reason why an introvert is a sort of latent paranoid is that the pattern making that introverts do can obviously under stress become, potentially paranoid.
Yeah.
Because that's what, if you put your trust fundamentally in your reading of the world over the world itself, then the way you're going to feel confident or reasonably confident going about the world is by developing a map of the world.
Absolutely.
That's how you feel confident, and that's why you've got to see patterns in the world. Whereas an extrovert, is putting more of their trust in that world, and almost like it will reveal itself to you as you explore it. It's more exploratory in that way.
Yeah.
But of course, the thing is that you've got dramatists that were introverts that would be writing about the social world. Say if we take a case that we've covered before, Pinter.
Yeah, of
I'm
course.
sure he was an introvert
Oh,
or
yes.
introverted enough.
Yeah.
And obviously his perceptions of human nature and the social world were dramatized in his plays.
Yes.
And of course, the way he saw the world is not how an extrovert would would see. I think the world overall, because he fundamentally focused on the power and subjection aspect of human relations. You know,
It's a great point, and I think when you get somebody like that who maybe would fit, say, the pattern or introvert way of being, but yet they then express their world. It can come up as
mm.
something incredibly unique, but very, very compelling. Because Pinter, certainly Pinter conveys this this vibe in his plays that is very recognizable and distinctive, but at the same time you can see his point sometimes. Actually, it's like it's not
Well, yes, yeah,
detached to that
absolutely.
degree. It's you can see what he's pointing at, even though there is a slight, well, it's obviously from his very subjective view. It's
Well, I mean,
interesting.
it's obviously coming from someone that was very watchful
Yeah.
of the world, but watchful to the point of an apprehensiveness. Now, I remember years ago that I was having this discussion, if I could put it that way, with someone that was more extrovert, and he was quite dismissive, about Pinter's plays. He said, "Yeah, I just think he was someone that was reclusive and needed to get out
Mm.
more." And
Wow.
I remember actually at the time, being quite, appalled by that judgment because it just seemed to be a callous dismissal. I
Yes.
mean, in terms of what we're discussing now, I can see that the guy, it's not as though he put it in a subtle way, and it's maybe not even what he was overall meaning. But in terms of what we've been discussing, we can see there's an element of a point in as far as that someone introverted and apprehensive in some way about human relations may overstate the case in which they're driven by power.
Yes.
And so we can see that in Pinter, say.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that he wasn't a genius and profound as well, but I think that equally there's a truth that there was a sort of well, I'm trying to think about the right word, almost a sort of hypochondria about human relations uh, as well.
Absolutely. But isn't it interesting that him and, say like Kafka, they both depicted this world that on the one hand is, almost like an exaggeration, but yet it's given rise to these, they've got their own words, Kafkaesque, Pinteresque, and it's something that
Yeah.
people get a waft of in certain situations, and it really, it helps them, it gives them something to connect it to, or it kind of becomes meaningful. So, it would seem like if they hadn't created these very unique, slightly paranoid worlds, we would all be a bit less rich in a
Oh,
way.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I
Um,
mean, the thing is that there weren't paranoid depictions that had no truth or point to them.
yeah,
And then, I mean, we have to also be fair that Pinter wasn't a philosopher that was committed to, um, try to falsify his view with the opposite, and
yeah,
sort of shave off the more acute edges and so on. I mean, an artist, has the right to portray the world as they see it.
yeah,
And even if it's exaggerated in some way, that doesn't make it inferior art, actually.
certainly not.
And,
No,
and I think also that sometimes heightening certain things allows us then to see them more, as you were intimating, in
yeah,
our everyday lives. Because the Pinteresque is so tangible in its plays, we can then see echoes of it or shadings of it in our everyday life. And that was the great virtue of it, I think.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I suppose to compare it to something like painting, where we think about some of the, the real extremes in art, that the different movements and the different, I suppose very, very subjectivist depictions that have gone far away from a realistic portrayal, but that in a way is what's great about them. That we're actually getting this very unique, different kind of perspective, actually. And certainly with something like Pinter and Kafka, to me, yeah, it is, the exaggeration, and if you could call it that, if that's quite the word, is the strength actually there.
Or the heightening.
The height, yeah, exactly, the heightening.
Really
It's
there.
so
But I
vivid.
think and it helps us to see it more in everyday life. And
Yeah,
it's maybe something a bit like what Wittgenstein spoke about with this phenomenon of seeing as, because, like we could look at a face, we could see a face, and then someone might say, oh, they look like so and so, and then we see it as that person.
yeah,
And so nothing's actually changed physically in their face, but we can start to look at their face in a different way because we're seeing it as analogous to somebody
yes,
else's face. And
yep,
I think it's the same that if you've got, say, like you're aware of the Pinteresque or the Chekhovian or the Kafkaesque, whatever, and then you're looking at your everyday life, you can see them as Pinteresque or Chekhovian. If there's some features of that in your life, it doesn't mean to say that that's exclusively how to see it,
no, no, no,
but it's one interesting and profitable way, aesthetic way of looking at life. Clearly, the thing with Pinter, Chekhov, Kafka, these geniuses, is that they had a very concentrated and pronounced and defined way of looking at life, and it was almost borrow their glasses or goggles to look at our own.
exactly. Borrow them, but yeah, I mean, it would become an issue if you simply saw life in that way all the time. But as you said, it's enriching to borrow that
Yes.
perspective. Yeah, that's
Well,
it.
yes, and I remember one writer had said about Pinter, poor Harold, he can only but write a Pinter play. And I mean, there's it's obviously a funny comment. There's a certain truth to it. But I
Yep.
mean, it's not as though that he was required to write it in any other way, but he just gave us a way of understanding certain aspects. We can see everyday life as Pinterest. We can see it as Chekhovian. We can
Yeah.
see it in an Ibsen way, whatever,
Yep.
and that these are different ways of looking at it.
So I mean, we have a final question. If you'd be happy to move on to
Yes,
that one,
yeah.
Alex, which is I suppose bringing all this up to date. Really, obviously we're now in a world that is quite a busy, noisy place. We have these devices around us, that can interrupt our lives at any moment, even when alone in a quiet room. So I'm wondering, to what extent do you think a lack of quality solitude is a factor in the array of mental health issues that are so prevalent these days? Do you think there's a link there, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, if we look at the Storr book, I don't think he necessarily puts it directly, but one of the implications of his book, if he's got a point, and I think we do believe he has a point, is that if you overemphasize the relational, it will impact your mental health.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think that we see that if we're always connected in some way to others through our mobiles or internet,
Mm-hmm.
and we're not getting that solitude, then it will impact adversely our mental health to some extent. That it will impact how much we can be in touch with our authentic selves. It will impact the degree in which we can be reflective and make sense of our lives, that coherence as well.
Yeah.
So I think if somebody's socializing a lot, there is a danger with that they could get impacted in a number of ways by those relationships and yet not be able to make sense of it because they haven't quite taken the opportunity of solitude. And I think you can see that sometimes with clients that's one of the reasons they come into therapy is that they want a chance to make sense of their lives when it seems as though they're rather dispersed.
I wonder. I mean, to me, I think modern technology might, in a way, give people kind of, to some extent, the worst of all worlds in terms of solitude versus company, because you could say on the one hand, some people probably socialize less actually because, say maybe younger people who are into things, maybe doing a lot of online gaming or, whatever it may be. Again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but, there could be a scenario now where some people are maybe having less time in company, yet in their solo time, they are continually through social media being exposed to social information, that could kind of provoke self-esteem concerns, lead them to feeling almost like they're being evaluated in relation to others, but they're not having almost like the grounding of in-person experiences of others that could give a kind of more positive, anchored sense of connection. So I wondered if maybe some maybe out of kilter balance of those two things is sometimes a bit of a problem for people.
I think it is, and I mean, in a way, social. If you're scrolling social media, sitting on your own, there is almost like a Sartrean element, like no exit element there, because it's like you're introducing that world into your solitude, and you're still trying to be shaped by these norms and by these and try to live up to these images, and so there isn't much of an escape then, and you're allowing these social media to imprint on the very fabric of your being in those moments that you could actually have more productive solitude.
Well, I wonder, I mean, we obviously talked earlier about the problems of things like rumination and so on, and the fact that, I mean, in my view, an excessive kind of self-consciousness in terms of an over, really dissecting of the self, particularly in comparison to others, is quite a toxic way to be, as opposed to the more self-transcendence. But yeah, obviously a continuous stream of social media type information, that can often have a bit of a people kind of putting a PR version of themselves across in an attempt maybe to look good or whatever it may be. That really, I mean, that kind of continuous stream could be really quite toxic for people. And I think obviously there's a lot written about the links between social media use and anxiety and depression and so on. So yeah, I thought it was just interesting to think about how that might feed into the point about solitude, because obviously it could actually be that, somebody who's really at risk of that is also having maybe the wrong kind of solitude as far as we were trying to define it.
I think you make a good point about that. If people are scrolling through social media and are self-conscious, that is that tends to be associated with mental ill health. So self-focus is actually seen to be connected to things like depression and anxiety. In a sense, when you're depressed or anxious, it's difficult to lose yourself in something fulfilling, because you're focused on the perceived wrongness of who you are.
Yep, absolutely.
And so that kind of solitude would tend to lead to recriminations and ruminations, like, why is my life not like my friends on Facebook? And so you're kind of daunted and haunted by this image or this advert of someone else's life, and you might then think that you're not good enough for those friends or good enough to be in wider society, and so it becomes more an isolating experience. And I think that we have to look at just the very practical point, which is that Storr was writing this book when people would have had landlines but no mobiles and no internet. So nowadays, most people during the day, people tend to have their phone on. And so that means that when you're sitting, say, even if you're productively reflecting or listening to some music, that you could get a text or a call any second. So it is actually, you might think, well, that's no big deal. But actually, psychologists have done experiments that show that people do not get immersed in their activities as much when their phones are nearby, because part of them is on call.
Yeah.
And they've actually done some experiments with people that were sitting in cafes, and at one group the phones were on the table, and another group the phones were switched off and put away. And they found that the people that put their phones away had deeper conversations.
Hmm.
The reason for that is that what's the point in opening up Breakfast Club style if a texting comes through and somebody says, "Oh, wait a minute, sorry." And oh
Yeah.
yeah, I've got to upload something to Instagram, or a notification.
I mean, it's a great point. I mean, obviously, Storr writing decades ago, I mean, it kind of made me smile at one point. I think he laments the fact that now cars have tape players in them and radios, and
Yeah, I know.
but I mean, I think, yeah, I guess what you're saying, I completely agree, is that quality, either solitude actually or social experience has, I think you used the word immersive. If we think about
Yeah.
somebody alone in a positive sense, reading, having a walk, watching a really good play or film or whatever, in all cases, the experience is going to be detracted by a constantly pinging device. I mean, it's not.
Yes,
I
of
mean,
course.
obviously, I'm not. We use these phones. Of course, messaging
I
people
mean,
use
we're as
phones.
guilty as anyone else
Yeah,
of
without
these
doubt,
things. So I mean,
without
but
doubt.
but
Yeah,
that's why we know why there's an issue there.
yeah, that's right.
With that, and so yeah, that thing about immersing yourself is so important, and this was something that the psychologist George Pransky spoke about, because he talks about the difference between investment versus involvement. And so
Mm,
he was making the point that the more ego invest you are in something, the harder it is then to be involved in it.
that's
So,
interesting.
so
Yeah,
the thing is that, take the typical perfectionistic student, because they're so invested in what grade they would get, it's hard for them then to sit down and get lost in their thoughts and write the thing.
yeah, of
And
course.
and
Yeah,
it's the same that if you're invested in, your social media image, say,
yeah,
and then you're sitting maybe wanting to trying to get immersed in something, but you get a notification, you get a ping.
yeah. That's
Then
indeed.
it's like you're conflicted between losing yourself in the activity or returning to something that you're invested in a sort of self-focused kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite diabolical, actually. I mean, obviously, the way that, people might put a post up, and then, of course, human nature being such that we're wondering, well, is it being liked? Is it, and of course, there's been research done, isn't there, into the impact on people's moods of, the extent to which they're liked or not liked. But in either
Yeah.
case, even if the post is getting lots of likes, as you suggested, it's pulling the person back into a kind of self-conscious ego mode rather than a self-transcending, I'm forgetting
Well, I
myself and
mean, the
doing
thing is
something.
that, well,
Sorry.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you maybe take a picture, you upload it to Instagram or Facebook, and you're wanting to, you're waiting on your likes, because that's a bit like having made a joke to an audience and you're waiting to see if there's a laugh and how
Yeah.
many laughs there's going to be.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
profound sense of suspense
Yep.
to that.
That's
And of
true.
course, you have to wait. So it might be protracted for a few hours until you get your first like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it's the
Indeed.
question of how many likes, and have the people that should like it liked it? Or has there been some friends that haven't liked it? And why haven't they liked it? Is that a sign I'm not close to them anymore?
Yeah. I
And
mean,
and
it's a
so
minefield, isn't it?
so
Yeah.
you can see that. I mean, I think that form of media is exploiting our need to feel to belong, and our fear of being ostracized or not being as popular.
Yeah.
And they know that it's something that we can get fixated on, and so they exploit that fixation.
Yeah, I mean, you do have to try quite hard in terms of changing the settings of things to not get constant notifications. It's
I'm sure
really
you
it's
do.
geared up to, as you say, exploit that thing that we all have, which is, as you said, if we tell a joke and it goes into silence, then nobody feels very good about that. That's just how we are. So
Well,
yeah,
yeah, but the
this is
thing is that, but in this case, it's worse because it goes into a limbo.
yeah, yes,
And then
that's
it's
right.
like, will there be a laugh, metaphorically speaking? Will there be a like?
Yeah.
And how many likes? and
Yep.
did the people that liked it before will like it now? I mean, or have they gone off me, or and so on. And of course, you end up worrying about a lot of people that you wouldn't even say hi to on the street.
Yes, that's right.
But it's not. It's not. It's a bit like these people that are called your friends on Facebook are really like your audience. So
Yeah.
I imagine a stand-up performer is not necessarily caring completely how the audience sees them over and beyond them laughing.
Yep.
Really.
Sure.
But it's that kind of protracted period of finding out what your fate is.
And it's and a bit again. I'm thinking of Sartre's No Exit. It's eternal. Whereas obviously the stand up can step off the stage and think about something else, but it's
Well,
24
yes,
hours
yeah.
a day. It never ends in terms of that. Any times, particularly when a piece of material's been put up on social media, which of course it's protracted. It could be in different time zones. You're getting reactions at different times, and then you put something else up. I mean, you can see why. And of course, the culture of posting, I mean, it could be that a person starts to think they're looking bad if they're not posting a certain amount, so really, I mean, it is very tricky one for people to really navigate. And
Well, that is, and I think it's also encouraging people to define themselves more by what is seen, rather than more by the visual.
Yep.
And this is something that Neil Postman wrote about in that book Age of Absurdity back in the 80s, about how TV would shape politics.
Yeah.
And what he prophesies has all come true about that. And I think so. There's a monopolization of the visual. We'll define ourselves more by that. We're going to define ourselves more by what is going to be sound bites like, rather than a more nuanced and considered version of ourselves. And again, we start to lose faith in who's wanting to hear that anyway. So we become like we become like people that have to be a pitch to a 1980s Hollywood cokehead producer. That doesn't has a very short-term attention span, and we've got to hook them.
It better be good, or you're out the door.
It better be good, otherwise they're on to somebody else. And so, and you can see then that when you lose faith in people's interest, that then when you're feeling really down, you feel particularly isolated, because that's not marketable material.
It's not marketable.
So in your dejection, you come to a therapist that will listen to that material.
You're right.
In the wider world, they don't generally.
Exactly. And it is for somebody who, say, their online life is a particularly important part of their social life. It could be that reaching out to connect is difficult there, because it can't always be easily separated from the sense of how am I being seen, or am I, as you say, I suppose if someone's particularly down, the idea of being seen is all the harder at that point. So
it is. I mean, it actually exacerbates a shame. There, almost like, well, I haven't really got the personality at the moment to project myself. Because I'm not. I'm not myself. I'm feeling down, or I'm feeling really anxious, and so they can feel like, well, people might not want to be around me.
And
I mean, I know that it was a joke, but like in a Rab Nesbitt episode, James E. Cotter says to Rab, he says, I know that your son's on a life support machine, but don't come with a tripping face to the pub. And I mean, I know that I mean, Ian Patterson, a great writer, it's brutal comedy, but there is a truth there. I'm not saying that most people would be sympathetic to some extent, but that's not what Patterson was meaning. He was meaning that that these sort of venues, these sort of things with your friends, they're not really for sharing your adversities with.
No. This is it. You're quite right. Inevitably, I mean, sometimes people maybe who do post something, maybe they will get quite, if it's say about a mental health struggle, they may get, consoling responses, but it's a risky thing to do. And of course, what if they don't? I mean, they could feel really, really bad.
It's very
It's
risky. I
not.
mean,
Yes, it's not. Yeah,
and as you say, how people respond and who responds can make a big difference,
yeah,
really.
yep,
But it's not probably the best vehicle for that.
yeah,
But yeah, I think it's like, that unwritten social contract that a lot of people feel, which is that, you don't really share your pain too much. That's for
yeah.
therapy and recovery groups.
Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, obviously, we talked earlier about these implicit cultural, say, biases towards extroversion and so on. But yeah, maybe in the modern world, these kind of implicit assumptions are maybe more toxic, more and maybe more prevalent. Actually, maybe that's more relevant to where we are now. And very, very, very damaging, to people's mental health. That kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, and I think that we should contrast that with Storr's humanism, which was saying that you shouldn't make your life answerable to anyone else. I mean, that's one of the things about the value solitude, and it's one of the harmful things about social media, in that you
Yeah.
end up putting your self worth on the market and
Yeah.
making it answerable to other people, which is. I mean, as I say, I can understand why people do it, but it is something that is very toxic, very corrosive.
You're right. I mean, I
Yeah.
guess, coming back to the point, the fundamental point about healthy, productive solitude, what I suppose what a lot of it boils down to is it should be a place that you can get more and more and more in touch with your own values and feel good about that process, and thus feel good about yourself. But yeah, obviously you don't want those values to be constantly getting affected by social judgment, but permeated by norms and and other kind of maybe even insidious assumptions. That is so detrimental actually to healthy solitude, that kind of environment, unfortunately.
Yes, and I mean, I think also the starting point is that even if people are seeing you mainly how you are, that can become potentially rigid in some ways, and that you can end up um, living a role that was at once more authentic identity, and that's why maybe you need to take time to regroup and reconnect with yourself, and then maybe also update your friends in a way.
Update. I thought you were going to say update your Facebook page. I thought that's really not the
But
angle.
I don't have a Facebook page. That's probably quite obvious by now. And I know
yes,
that
yes.
I know that cynics are going to just say, "Well, this is because of the response they've got to their podcast, social media." That's why
There's always a
they're,
cynical reading possible. Yes.
yes, but I think that would not be a charitable and realistic reading of the situation.
I would say so. I would say that would be very unfair. Yes.
But if people are willing to think that, fair enough. Or some people.
Indeed. Well, I think we really have kind of filled the time slot there on that one, Alec. But that it's been really good talking about all the different elements of solitude. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground there with that one. So
yes,
well, thank you.
And so you're going to ask about we off to have some solitude.
Yes, I could do that, but no, I thought I
or
won't
is it,
put you on the spot.
He's going away to retreat and seethe and resentment over something?
And he's going to write a scathing post on Twitter about it.
Yeah, no, that was great. Okay,
yes, that is great. Well, thank you,
Thank you.